I realized my name wasn't even listed in my parents' will. Everything went to my brother. So I quietly stopped covering their expenses. A month later, Dad messaged, "Power's about to get cut." No greeting, no explanation. I simply responded with one word and severed contact. I, 34M, discovered my parents' will last Tuesday while helping my dad organize his office. The document was sitting right there on his desk, partially covered by old bills. I wasn't snooping. He'd asked me to help sort through his financial papers because Mom had been having memory issues lately. My hands went numb as I read through the pages. Every asset, every account, every piece of property they owned was going to my brother. The house where I'd grown up. The savings account I'd been contributing to for years. Dad's vintage car collection. Even Mom's jewelry that she'd always said would be mine someday. My name appeared exactly 0 times in the entire document. I sat there staring at those pages for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. 26 years of being the responsible son crashed through my mind. 26 years of covering their bills when Dad's business struggled. 26 years of taking care of their house repairs, their medical expenses, their car payments. Meanwhile, my brother had been living across the country, calling maybe twice a year, never sending money, never visiting for holidays. The math was brutal. I'd calculated it once during a sleepless night last year. I'd spent nearly $180,000 on their expenses over the past decade. Money that could have gone toward my own house, my own future, my own retirement. Instead, I'd been living in a cramped apartment while making sure their mortgage stayed current. Dad walked back into the office and found me holding the will. He glanced at the papers in my hands, and his face went pale. I asked him when this was written, and he mumbled something about updating it last month. I asked why my name wasn't included, and he shifted uncomfortably, saying they'd thought my brother needed more help since he had kids. That stung. I'd been helping them for over a decade because I didn't have kids yet, because I'd prioritized their needs over starting my own family, because every time I'd saved enough for a down payment on a house, some emergency would pop up and I'd transfer the money to their account instead. I folded the will carefully and placed it back on his desk. I told him I understood, wished him a good day, and left. The drive home was a blur of rage and disbelief. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I opened my laptop and started canceling automatic payments. Their electric bill, canceled. Water bill, canceled. Internet and cable, canceled. Their supplemental health insurance that I'd been covering, canceled. The monthly transfer I'd been sending to help with groceries, stopped. It took 3 hours to undo a decade of financial entanglements. Each cancellation felt like pulling off a bandage that had been stuck to my skin for years. By midnight, I'd severed every financial connection between us. The next few weeks were strange. My bank account actually had money left at the end of the month for the first time in years. I bought groceries without calculating whether I could afford them. I even splurged on a nice dinner at a restaurant I'd been wanting to try. Mom called twice during those weeks, but I let it go to voicemail. She rambled about doctor appointments and complained about the neighbor's dog. Normal stuff. She didn't mention any problems with bills or utilities. Maybe Dad hadn't noticed yet, or maybe he was handling things himself for once. 3 weeks in, my brother called. This was unusual. We maybe talked once every few months, and usually only about family emergencies. He asked how I was doing, which was even more unusual since our conversations typically lasted under 5 minutes. He mentioned that Dad had called him asking about money for some repair work on the house. The furnace was acting up, and the estimate was around $3,000. My brother had told Dad he was strapped for cash with the kids' school expenses and suggested Dad call me instead. I told my brother I wasn't covering their expenses anymore. There was a long silence on the other end. He asked what I meant, so I explained about finding the will and learning about their inheritance plans. Another long silence. He said he hadn't known about the will's contents. He claimed Dad had never discussed it with him. Whether that was true or not, I didn't care anymore. I told him if he was inheriting everything, he could start contributing financially. The call ended awkwardly. For weeks after I'd stopped the payments, my phone buzzed with a text from Dad. No greeting, no small talk, just 7 words. Power's about to get cut. Need help now. I stared at that message for a long time. Part of me felt guilty. These were my parents, after all. I'd grown up in that house, eaten countless meals at their kitchen table, been tucked into bed in that upstairs room for 18 years. But another part of me felt something I'd never experienced before, a sense of my own worth. For decades, I'd been their safety net while my brother lived his life without any financial responsibilities toward our parents. For decades, I prioritized their comfort over my own future. And in return, they'd written me out of their legacy entirely. I typed one word back, no. Then I blocked both their numbers. Update 1. It's been 6 months since I cut contact, and I'm still processing everything that's happened. The first few weeks were the hardest. I kept expecting to feel worse about my decision, but instead, I felt lighter than I had in years. My brother called from a different number about 2 months after I blocked our parents. He'd driven across the country to help them deal with their financial crisis. The power had indeed been shut off, along with the water a week later. Dad had apparently been juggling bills for months, using credit cards to cover basic expenses once my payments stopped. My brother was angry, but not at me. He was furious with our parents for never telling him how much I'd been contributing. He'd assumed Dad's business was still doing well and that they were financially stable. Learning that I'd been subsidizing their lifestyle for over a decade while being excluded from their will had shaken him. He told me he'd confronted them about the inheritance situation. Mom, in one of her clearer moments, had admitted they'd always assumed I'd never get married or have kids, so I wouldn't need the inheritance as much as he would. The logic was stunning in its cruelty. They decided my future based on my current circumstances, never considering that their financial dependence on me might be part of why I hadn't been able to build my own life yet. Dad, according to my brother, had been defensive at first. He'd argued that I'd never complained about helping them, so he'd thought I was fine with the arrangement. When my brother pointed out that the will didn't even include a small token for me, Dad had gone quiet. My brother had given them an ultimatum. Either they revised the will to split things more fairly, or he wouldn't help them financially either. He had his own family to think about, and if they expected him to inherit everything, they needed to treat me with basic respect. They'd agreed to change the will, and my brother sent me a photo of the new version. It wasn't a perfect 50-50 split. I was getting about 40% of their assets, but it was a massive improvement over nothing. Along with the photo, he'd sent a long message apologizing for never stepping up financially and for not realizing how unfairly I'd been treated. But here's the thing. I didn't unblock their numbers or respond to my brother's attempts to reconcile on their behalf. The will change felt like too little, too late. It wasn't really about the money anymore, though the money mattered. It was about respect, about being valued, about 26 years of being taken for granted. Update 2. 8 months later, and my life has changed in ways I never expected. With the money I was no longer sending to my parents, I'd finally saved enough for a down payment on a house. A real house, not the apartment I'd been stuck in for years while funding their lifestyle. The house hunt was surreal. For the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions based purely on what I wanted, not on what I could afford after covering someone else's expenses. I found a small but perfect place about 30 minutes from my old apartment. It has a garden, which I'd always wanted, and a garage where I can finally pursue some hobbies I'd abandoned years ago. Moving day was bittersweet. I kept expecting my phone to ring with some family emergency that would derail my plans, but it stayed quiet. My brother had called a few more times from different numbers, but I'd stopped answering calls from numbers I didn't recognize. About a week after I moved in, my neighbor knocked on my door. She was an older woman, probably in her 70s, with kind eyes and a plate of homemade cookies. She welcomed me to the neighborhood and mentioned that she'd noticed I was around my age and wondered if I had family nearby. I found myself telling her a simplified version of my story. She listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making small sympathetic sounds. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before sharing her own experience with family financial dynamics. Her son had been supporting her financially for years after her husband died, she explained. But unlike my parents, she'd made sure he was the primary beneficiary in her will and had openly discussed her gratitude for his help. She'd also insisted on contributing what she could and had downsized her lifestyle to reduce the burden on him. Her perspective helped me realize something I'd been struggling to articulate. It wasn't that I'd expected to be rewarded for helping my parents. Family should help family. But I'd expected basic consideration, acknowledgement, and respect for the sacrifices I'd made. The will had just been the final proof that they'd never really valued what I'd given up for them. 3 weeks into living in my new house, I was working in the garden when a car pulled into my driveway. My heart sank as I recognized my brother's rental car. He'd somehow found my new address. He got out slowly, looking tired and older than I remembered. He approached carefully, like someone trying not to spook a wild animal. He said he'd gotten my address from my old landlord and hoped I'd be willing to talk. I stayed kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds, and told him he had 5 minutes. He explained that our parents' health had deteriorated significantly over the past few months. Mom's memory issues were getting worse, and Dad had been diagnosed with early-stage heart disease. They were struggling both financially and emotionally, and Dad had been asking about me constantly. My brother said he'd been trying to help them, but living across the country made it difficult. He'd hired a local service to help with some of their needs, but it was expensive and impersonal. They needed family, he said. They needed me. I asked him if they'd ever explicitly apologized for the whole situation or acknowledged how they'd treated me. He was quiet for a moment before admitting that Dad still seemed to think he'd done nothing wrong, though Mom had expressed regret during her clearer moments. I told him I appreciated him coming, but I wasn't ready to resume contact. Maybe someday, but not now. The hurt was still too fresh, and I was finally building a life that felt like my own. He nodded, looking disappointed but not surprised. Before he left, he handed me a piece of paper with their current phone numbers and address, just in case I changed my mind. He also mentioned that they'd put the house up for sale and were looking into assisted living facilities. After he drove away, I sat in my garden for a long time, holding that piece of paper. Part of me felt guilty for not rushing back to help them through their health problems. But a larger part of me recognized that this was exactly the pattern that had trapped me for so many years. Every time I tried to establish boundaries or prioritize my own needs, some crisis would emerge that pulled me back in. Update 3. It's been over a year now since I cut contact, and I'm writing this final update because I think I've finally found some peace with my decision. Last month, my brother called to tell me that Dad had passed away from a sudden heart attack. He tried to reach me through multiple channels before the funeral, but I'd maintained my boundaries. I didn't attend the service, and I know that decision will follow me for the rest of my life. But here's what I've learned over the past year. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop accepting treatment that diminishes your worth. My parents raised me, fed me, clothed me, and gave me opportunities in life. I'm grateful for that foundation. But gratitude doesn't mean accepting a lifetime of being undervalued. The inheritance situation resolved itself in an unexpected way. Dad had apparently made some poor financial decisions in his final months, trying to maintain their lifestyle without my support. By the time everything was settled, there wasn't much left to inherit anyway. The house sold for less than expected due to deferred maintenance, and most of the proceeds went to paying off debts I hadn't even known about. Mom is now in assisted living, and my brother visits her when he can. Her memory issues have progressed to the point where she doesn't really remember the conflict we had. Sometimes she asks about me, he tells me, but mostly she lives in her own world now. I've started therapy to work through the complex emotions around family, duty, and self-worth. My therapist helped me understand that what I experienced was a form of financial abuse, even if it wasn't intentional. My parents had become so accustomed to my support that they'd stopped seeing me as a person with my own needs and dreams. The most unexpected outcome of this whole situation has been the relationship I've built with my brother. After Dad's death, he reached out one more time, not to guilt me into reconciling with Mom, but to apologize for his own role in the family dynamics. He admitted that he'd been content to let me carry the financial burden because it meant he didn't have to sacrifice anything for our parents. We've been talking regularly now, building an adult relationship that's separate from our childhood roles. He's planning to visit next month to meet the woman I've been seeing. Another positive change that happened once I stopped pouring all my emotional and financial energy into my parents' problems. I still think about that text from Dad sometimes. Power's about to get cut. No greeting, no acknowledgement of our relationship, just an expectation that I'd solve his problem. My one-word response, no, felt harsh in the moment. But it was the first time in my adult life that I'd prioritized my own well-being over their immediate needs. Would I handle things differently if I could go back? Maybe I would have tried to have a conversation about the will before cutting contact entirely. Maybe I would have given them a chance to explain or apologize. But I also know that pattern of hoping they'd change, of giving them one more chance, had kept me trapped for decades. Some people will read this and think I was cruel to elderly parents who needed help. Others will think I should have stood up for myself years earlier. I think both perspectives have merit. Family relationships are complicated, and there's rarely a clear right or wrong answer. What I know for certain is that cutting financial ties with my parents, as painful as it was, gave me the space to build a life that actually belongs to me. I own a house now. I'm in a healthy relationship with someone who values and respects me. I have savings for the first time in my adult life. I've discovered hobbies and interests that had been buried under years of financial stress and family obligation. The cost was steep. I lost my relationship with my parents, and I'll always carry some regret about how things ended. But the alternative was spending the rest of my life as an unpaid caretaker for people who saw my contributions as an obligation rather than a gift. Sometimes the most radical act of self-love is simply saying no to people who take your yes for granted, even when those people raised you. Especially when those people raised you. That one word, no, changed everything. And a year later, I still don't regret it.